We're going to wrap up this week tracing from the Edomites, from Esau and Jacob, to the present day, how do you say, unpleasantries in the Middle East, especially is driven by these people called the Palestinians. Just to review very slightly, most of you have been here through the class, we've traced so far that Esau had become the Edomites and Jacob became Israel, so they're two separate sets of peoples, but they're brothers, they're twins, or the genesis of them are twins. Eventually, Jacob stays in the land of Canaan, and Edomites migrate to Edom, that's where they call it Edomites, which is in the southern area of Jordan, what's now Jordan, and I showed you that on the map, which is, if you look at Israel, Jordan is to the right. You have Lebanon to the north, right? You have Egypt to the southwest rather. You have Syria up here next to Lebanon, and on the right-hand side, you have a pretty large area called Jordan. And if you know the West Bank, the reason why it's called the West Bank is because they say that it's the West Bank of Jordan. So Jordan figures very greatly in all of this. I have a couple of interesting quotes I'll read to you today as we get finished here. But remember who Golda Meir was, Prime Minister of Israel? She had something to say about these Palestinians. I also have a quote from the head of the executive committee of the PLO. Now, you know who the PLO is, and it was started by Arafat in 1964. It's the Palestinian Liberation Organization. These quotes are old. Golda Meir's quote was when she was prime minister back in 1969, and the other one from this executive committee head was from 1977. This has been going on a long time, but these both quotes tell exactly the same thing. So we're going to get into that. So we're at the point now where we looked at the book of Obadiah. Obadiah, how many chapters? Remember how many chapters Obadiah has? You can count them on one finger. And that book is dedicated to the rise and fall of Edom, mostly the fall of Edom. This is how greatly Edom factors into all of this. Obadiah 1 chapters, you don't have to turn there, I'm just going to summarize. Obadiah, of course, I'm going to say chapter 1 even though there's only one chapter. So Obadiah chapter 1, verses 3 and 4 talk about Edom's pride, the pride of Edom. Verse 10 talks about the violence against their brother Jacob. It summarizes that. Verses 11 through 14 talks about Edom standing by and sneering and even assisting and taking advantage of the situation of Jacob being taken advantage of by strangers. By the way, I wanted to tell you, it was very interesting when I was doing some research on this last week. Everybody knows who King Nebuchadnezzar was, head of Babylon. Went into Israel 3 times, finally sacked Jerusalem, took everybody captive, and took the temple implements back with him. There's a little known fact, I don't know if it's little known, it's kind of obscure, we'll put it that way, that during the last siege, when he went in there and actually sacked the temple, he was actually asking, because there were a lot of people standing around watching the spectacle, and they weren't going to get involved, but they weren't exactly so horrified at what was being done to Israel. Guess who some of those people were? Edomites. They were Arabs. Edomites were there. And he asked who would like to participate in actually this last sacking of the temple. And Edom participated. It's been interesting. It's a little known fact. You see, Obadiah is right, and God's anger is right about what Esau is trying to do. This is all the fulfillment of the prophecy of the house of Esau, which was back in Genesis chapter 27, verses 36 through 40, when God says what's going to happen to Esau in the last time. Basically, they're going to be destroyed because of what they've done. I'm going to read it to you if you want to turn there. Genesis chapter 20, did I say 37? Chapter 27, verse 36. This is the prophecy of the house of Esau by Isaac. I'm just going to review this with you. Remember, we have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and of course Esau. Remember, you know the whole story about the stolen birthright, and then Jacob tricks Isaac into giving him the blessing of the older, which is Esau. Genesis chapter 27, verse 36. Esau said, "Isn't he rightly named Jacob? He has deceived me these 2 times. He took my birthright, and now he's taken my blessing." Oh man, he's angry. And then he asked, "Haven't you reserved any blessing for me?" He's asking Father Isaac. Isaac answered Esau. Now listen to this. This is part of the prophecy here. Now, first of all, think of this, right? He's asking, "Dad, don't you have a blessing for me?" And he goes right away into an exact opposite. He doesn't even say, "No, I don't have a blessing for you." He just starts telling him what this quote-unquote blessing is going to be. And it's like, I would be devastated if I were Esau. So don't you have any blessing for me? And in verse 37, Isaac says to Esau, he says, "I have made him lord over you and have made all his relatives his servants, and I have sustained him with grain and new wine. So what can I possibly do for you?" He says, "Do you have only one blessing for me? Bless me too, my father, bless me." And then he answers him, Here's the blessing, the same thing. Doesn't even tell him it's not really a blessing. Sure, son. He says, your dwelling will be away from the earth's richness. By the way, if you remember, isn't that what Esau depended on? He was a man of the earth. I mean, so this is a real curse. This is like an anti-blessing, if you will. Away from the dew of heaven. You will live by the sword. Now, that is key. You will live by the sword. Let me ask you a question. If you see some of the flags of even some of the Arab nations, there's a sword. You ever see some pictures of Iraq? There's the gates with the two swords. Aren't they living by the sword? Whenever they go there, they're saber rattling. Right? Who else really does that as much, if at all? So you will live by the sword and you will serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you will throw his yoke from off your neck. So that's where we are today. Let's turn to Obadiah chapter 1 again, verse 11. I just want to review some of these things. So that's the quote-unquote blessing. Would you say that that has not happened? Have you ever read, and I don't have time to go over to here, but have you ever read when the dying Jacob blesses the 12 sons of Israel? You see how prophetic those blessings are? It is amazing. It is amazing. They come true. So here it is. I'm going to read this to you as I have it in my notes, but I just mentioned it. This is the thing about Nebuchadnezzar as you turn into Obadiah chapter 1. An interesting note is that King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, who brought on the captivity of Israel, came into Jerusalem the third time, which is what I mentioned to you, in 586 BC to finally bring down the temple. History records many peoples watching the spectacle and cheering the destruction of Judah. Remember, Samaria, the other tribes had already been sacked. They had already been gone. They were already taken captive. Nebuchadnezzar decided to cast lots to those there to allow others to participate in the quote-unquote final solution, the final destruction of the temple. The lot fell to the Edomites. Isn't that interesting? They had the quote-unquote privilege of destroying the first temple. Now, I never knew that. I never knew that they were actually ones helping Babylon tear down the temple. Now, you remember back in the Old Testament when lots were cast, that was a way of God actually showing his will. Well, here's another way. I mean, this is the key. The Edomites were not only there, as we saw back in Genesis, we'll see in Obadiah here, I just read it to you. They sneer as they are bystanders and even participants in others sacking Judah, actually. Now we're going to see again what Obadiah chronicles about the doom of Edom, about 254 years before the conquest of the temple by Nebuchadnezzar. So Obadiah was written about 254 years before Edom had the pleasure of even participating in ripping down the temple when it was under conquest by Babylon, by Nebuchadnezzar. Obadiah chapter 1 verse 11. On the day you stood aloof, while strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates and cast lots for Jerusalem. You were like one of them. Didn't we just talk about that? And here's a prophecy 254 years before it happened. Can anybody say that the Bible's not true? And again, Obadiah is one of those obscure books that if you're not particularly know what it's talking about, you're just going to gloss over it. That's why, again, I'll stress, never try to read the Bible as a novel. It's very good to say read the Bible in a year and all those kind of things. It's great. But don't expect to get a lot out of it unless you study history. You're not going to. You're just not going to get the depth. It's not going to happen. Verse 12, you should not look down on your brother in the day of his misfortune, nor rejoice over the people of Judah in the day of their destruction. What day was that? When Nebuchadnezzar sacked the temple. Nor boast so much in the day of their trouble. You should not march through the gates of my people in the day of their disaster. Now, the gates of my people is Jerusalem, the gates of the city, which they had to march into with Nebuchadnezzar's throng to finally sack that temple. Nor seize their wealth in the day of their disaster. Now, one of the things that Nebuchadnezzar did was what? When he destroyed the temple, he seized their wealth. Remember Belshazzar, the very end of the empire there? Remember the handwriting on the wall? Remember the hand was writing on the wall? It says your kingdom has been found weighed and found wanting and all that stuff. And his knees began to knock together because he couldn't understand this handwriting on the wall. You remember there's a little verse there that people gloss over. And it says that the handwriting was being written on the wall by the lamp. You know what that lamp was? You know why it's even mentioned? That lamp was the menorah that was taken from the temple at this time. and brought back to Babylon. Belshazzar was considered, he probably was, no one really knows for 100% sure, but he was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. But this is after Nebuchadnezzar's death. Belshazzar's eating and drinking and having a merry old time, using the instruments from the temple, the cup and everything, and standing there partying and and going into all kinds of debauchery in the light that was given by the menorah. And now the handwriting of God writes in the light of the menorah on the wall, and Belshazzar says, think of the import of this. This is talking about the time when Edom helped Nebuchadnezzar take those implements out of that temple and bring them to Babylon. And the end of the Babylonian rule was Belshazzar, when he was murdered that night, when God, the handwriting on the wall, and you know the rest of the story. Isn't that interesting? This is what it's talking about. Obadiah chapter 1 and verse 14. You should not wait at the crossroads to cut down their fugitives. So there were people who escaped, nor hand over their survivors in the day of trouble. Now, I want to ask you a question. If you look at the way things are rolling out today, there is going to be a third temple. You know that. You should know that. If you don't, there will be. It's prophesied. It will happen. But that's going to be in the day of whose reign? Antichrist. Absolutely. Right. What do you think is going to happen 3.5 years into the tribulation? Well, the third temple will be there, but that's right. That's the abomination that causes decimation. Oh, I was close. I get tongue-tied. I don't know why. I just can't think of these words sometimes, because I'm getting senior moments here more and more as I go on. But anyway. So that's what's going to happen. He's going to move in there, and he is going to say he is God, and that is going to be akin to, remember what Jesus said, as spoken of by Daniel the prophet, when the abomination that causes desolation happens, he who readeth understand, in parenthesis, you have to understand this. That was talking about not only what happened with Antiochus Epiphanes, when he sacrificed a pig on the altar before the Maccabean period there, but this is also going to be the same thing. He's making it akin that the sacking of the temple, to the taking over of the temple, or is desecrating the temple by Nebuchadnezzar, and of course the implements were used in desecration, by Antiochus Epiphanes, and of course the Antichrist. It's the same thing. And he's saying that in the future when this happens, guess who's going to be around? The Edomites, the Arabs, or these subgroup of Arabs called Edomites. And I look at this, having said all of that, I look at this and I suggest you look at this as not only reviewing what we talked about, as prophecy 254 years before it happened. But look at Obadiah as also chronicling what is yet again going to happen with these people as they stand by and sneer and participate when the Antichrist finally comes in and goes to seek to destroy Israel. And by the way, where does God take Israel when they finally figure this out and they're going to flee? Which is? Petra, which is where Edom lived. And remember, God said you will mount as if you're living on wings of eagles, because they lived in the clefts of the rock. By the way, remember that term eagles, because it factors. Again, showing that there's a thread that God, I'm telling you, the persistence of memory through DNA on up is absolutely astounding. It must be God having total control of Israel and also the enemies of Israel and all of their destinies, because all of this stuff ties in and they never seem to forget the important details generation to generation. It is amazing. They can always be identified. Anyway, moving on. So Jeremiah, you don't have to turn there, but Jeremiah devotes chapters 50 and 51 to the punishment and painful and scornful destruction of Babylon because of what they did to the house of Judah, which we just talked about. How much more will Edom, because he helped destroy his brother? By the way, just as a little tidbit, I've mentioned this before. How long was the captivity of Israel in Babylon? How long was that captivity? Do you remember? 70 years. 70 years to the day. And guess what? Daniel, remember he prayed? And finally an angel, and I think it was Jesus, but I'm not sure. But it was said that your prayers were answered the day you prayed, but it was actually like 21 days or something like that before he came. You know why he prayed? Because he knew it was close to the end of 70 years. You know how Daniel knew that? And because he says it in his book. He was studying the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah and he were contemporaries. Isn't that interesting? So even Daniel relied on Jeremiah. And of course, he must have read what we consider, in those days, the scrolls didn't have chapters and verses. But what we consider 50 and 51, chapters 50 and 51, is punishment and scornful destruction of Babylon. He read that, and he knew that obviously that wasn't going to happen during the captivity. It had to happen after the captivity, and he also knew that it was prophesied to be 70 years. Anyway, both Edom and Babylon, just as Sodom and Gomorrah, they will be totally wiped out, and not a remembrance of them will be for eternity. So let's move forward now to the intertestamental period. You know, the period between the end of the Old Testament, which is the book of Malachi, right? And then the first book in the New Testament is Matthew. And what's the first thing that pretty much happens in Matthew? John the Baptist comes on the scene. Well, there's about 430 years between that. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. It's at the close of the Old Testament period. There's a lot of suffering, a lot of pain, a lot of promises, a lot of unfulfilled dreams, a lot of unfulfilled prophecy. And now all of a sudden, at the close of Malachi, God says nothing. And there's a lot that happens. And this is not going to be a history lesson and all of that, but if you've ever heard of the period of the Maccabees, there was a lot that went on there. And it forms the point at which Jesus comes in the New Testament and is put, first of all, with Herod. What does he know when the Magi come and ask the Magi, what are you here for? And what do they say? We heard that the King of the Jews has been born. What is Herod's immediate response? Can't tell the Magi, I want to destroy the King of the Jews, nip this thing in the bud, so that's the rest of the story. But here's the point. Herod, who was considered, because he was the tetrarch of the area of Judea, he actually ruled the whole area because Jerusalem and Israel, Judah, was a client state of Rome by that time. And a lot of this happened, a lot of the formulation of this happened during the Maccabean period. I call it the Maccabean period, but during the intertestamental period. There's a lot of history and lineage of the Edomites we don't have time to go into, and that's part of it. But the Edomites are attacked by their distant cousins, the Nabateans. And these are Arabian people, and they are descendants of Ishmael. Now remember that. The Arab are descendants of Ishmael. People have said erroneously that the Egyptians were the descendants of Ishmael, but that's not true because Ishmael's mother was an Egyptian. So obviously you can't be, because the Egyptians already existed. So the Arabs are a descendant of Ishmael. Remember that. The Nabateans were excellent traders in many goods and became in league with the Roman economy at that time. Because, you know, Rome ruled the world. So if you were going to do well, guess who you had to deal with? You had to pay taxes to them, you had to pay tribute to them, and you had to trade with them. And that was just the story. And these Nabateans used the King's Highway. Ooh, didn't we just talk about the King's Highway? As their major trade route. Now again, the Nabateans were very skilled traders. Sort of like today, when you see these big companies like Maersk Lines and ITEL, and they have these big container shipping systems, these are today's mega traders. The Nabateans were akin to those people in those days. They really had trade wrapped up. So that's just to give you some understanding here. Some Edomites, when they had a problem with the Nabateans, and some Edomites actually escaped to travel west. The Edomites were attacked by them. Now remember, Edomites used to come out of the Seek, it's the space about 8 feet wide, 8 to 10 feet wide. They used to ransack the traders on the King's Highway and then draw them back in and then marauder them after they took their goods. I mean, it was sort of like a comedy skit, it seemed to me. You know, you steal the stuff, they come running after you, you say, come on, get me, you can get your stuff back if you can get me, and they get into the Seek and all of a sudden they pour boiling water on them and stuff like that, you know. So, but the Nabateans were actually very good, and they actually routed them. And so some of them escaped and traveled west. They came into southern Judah, and then they changed their names, and this is the important part of this little bit of history. They changed their names. Now remember, this is in the Roman period. They changed their names to the Idumeans, which is just really a Greek transliteration for Edomites. But if you don't know that, and I didn't know that for a long time, if you don't know that, you think it's the Edomites and the Idumeans, they must be separate people. You would never tie them together, but they are. And here's what's important. Because the line of the Edomites now changing their name in the Roman times to Idumeans, their lineage is traced into Antipater II, and then the Herods. Remember I mentioned that last week? In the book of Esther also, remember the wretched Haman? He was a high nobleman in the court of King Xerxes, and most of you know that story. He wanted to destroy the nation of Israel, so he was kind of cunning, and he actually convinced Xerxes that Israel was going to pretty much take over. He better nip this thing in the bud. That's pretty much what happens. I'm going to read you. You don't have to turn there. Just listen. From Esther chapter 3 and verse 8 and 9. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed and scattered among the people in the provinces of your kingdom, king, whose customs are different from those of all other people and who do not want to obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." By the way, this was said one time before in a major way. In Egypt. In Egypt. Pharaoh was concerned because the Israelites, we haven't gotten there yet with the story of Joseph and beyond. We're going to start that next week. But Pharaoh was concerned because the Israelites were multiplying like crazy. They had a higher birth rate than the native Egyptians. Same problem. What's the solution? Enslave them and get rid of them. So he says it's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. What a deceiver, huh? He's going to put a price on Israel's head. You think there won't be any takers? People would kill Israel for free. Can you imagine if he puts a price on their head? So Haman was a descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek, which we'll get into eventually when we get to 1 Samuel, a decade from now. Agag was the descendant of Agag, the king of Amalek, and he descended from Esau. So this is a lineage. You see the lineage I'm tracing out for you here? Here's a brief timeline now as we move through them at the end of the Maccabean period. So we come through, I gave you a little bit of a thread there. I'm not going to go through all that happened there, but you basically understand what happened in the intertestamental period. It's all under Roman rule. If you remember in the book of Daniel, there are 4 Gentile empires that are going to take over. The bottom one was Rome, and this is where we are now when Jesus comes. So what's the final power that's going to take over? The resurrected Roman Empire during the tribulation, which we're getting to. So when Jesus comes, you remember it's the end of, not the end of, but it's now the church age begins. The New Testament happens and the laws get modified. We talked about that because it's a period of time called the church age. But the point is that Jerusalem and, of course, the Temple Mount, all of that area is still under Gentile rule until Jesus Christ comes back for his second coming and become King of Kings and Lords of Lords. Then, of course, he breaks all of that and takes over the kingdom. So now we're at the end of the Maccabean period, just around the cusp of when Jesus Christ is going to come. So marking the close of the Maccabean period of the Hasmonean kingdom, which was started by the Maccabees. Remember General Pompey? You ever hear of him in your high school history class? I thought it was like a mayonnaise or something when I first heard it. It was like Pompey. Oh, Grey Poupon, mustard, that's it. Pompey captures Jerusalem for the Roman Empire. Oh, so now see, Rome is expanding. Now, Rome has a little problem with Jerusalem. We won't get into that much here, but suffice to say that they were able to conquer other nations and other peoples as they went out and conquered the known world at the time. Because what they did is that they didn't want to enslave them so much because they wanted them to produce and they wanted them to pay taxes. So what they did is they sort of inculcated it into their religions, their mythology, and they gave them their culture. They gave them a great set of laws. I mean, Rome, the Roman society was a great society. It really was. It was evil, but it was very well put together, just like Greece before them. But when they got to Israel, or what's now Israel, or Palestine, which the Romans named it Palestine back, and Titus did that, but they had a little problem. See, the Jews don't want to be anything but Jews, and they will not be conquered. Hallelujah to God, because that he will not allow his people to be conquered, and they wouldn't be. So there was a lot of fighting, and one of those things was the intertestamental period. And there's always been a lot of fighting. Everybody wants to conquer the Jews, and they will not be conquered. Isn't that something? But Pompey does capture Jerusalem, and now it's a client state. So this area now is a client state of Rome. And they install their governors. They install rulers that rule it as a province, if you will. But it's not really a province, it's a client state. So they're having there's this tension between the Jews and Rome all the time. A lot of wars. And if you ever look at the book of Josephus, you're going to look and read the detail about the Jewish wars. It was because they don't want to be ruled. So back in BC, 63 BC, Pompey captures Jerusalem on behalf of Rome, and now it becomes a Roman client state. After Pompey, Julius Caesar sets up Antipater I as the procurator, the governor-type person, if you will, of Judea. Antipater I rebuilds the walls of Jerusalem, which were torn down during that intertestamental period, and convinces the Jews to submit to the new government. Now, again, submission for a Jew is different. They'll get along, like when they got dispersed in the diaspora. They became the best countrymen in the countries that they were banished to, right? Which also got them in trouble because they were better Germans than the Germans. And in this country, they were better, as far as the brain trust, as far as inventing, as far as what they do for a country, they build it up until people get, wait a minute, these people are going to take over, we got to get rid of them, that kind of thing, which we just read about. So there's this push and pull, this tug of war between Israel and the rest of the world, which of course is natural. So Antipater rebuilds this. The Jews kind of submit, but of course they don't really submit. They just have to survive. That's sometimes what they do. Now, Antipater II comes along, and his second son, so Antipater II comes along, and his second son is named Herod. But he is the first of the two Herods. He's Herod the Great. And Herod the Great now takes over, and he reigns from 37 BC to 4 BC. So now we're getting into the birth time of Jesus Christ, just around when Jesus was born. So he is made king of Judea, thus becoming, in effect, the first king of the Jews since the real kings, because they're from Rome, and now he's considered the king of the Jews. Herod now expands the temple. So Zerubbabel's temple is now expanded. So you've seen the glorious temple before it gets destroyed in AD 70 by Titus and the Roman army. That second temple was not that pretty when Zerubbabel rebuilt it after the return from the exile from Babylon. But Herod, in order to now capitulate to the Jews, he also knew that he thought he had some Jewish background in him because Antipater I was an Idumean, which was of Esau, which is a twin of Jacob. And so the line, remember I said the Palestinians and by extension the Arabs are cousins of Israel, and their DNA is the same because they came from twins. So you can see back this thread, even though there's a fight between them, they're still the same, genetically the same people. So if you have Idumean blood, you may think you're a Jew. Okay, so even though he doesn't want to be a Jew, he's sort of feeling Jewish, and that's part of the story here. But when he expands and beautifies the temple, he does one thing which a lot of people don't know. One thing in particular, I mean, he does a lot of things, but one thing in particular, he puts a golden eagle at the top of the entrance to the temple. A golden eagle. Now remember I said a few minutes ago to remember the term eagle? Because we read a couple of weeks ago when we started this that God talked about the Edomites being as eagles living in the clefts of the rock. So here's this line of Edomite through Idumea, through the Antipaters, through Herod. Of course, even though he's feeling kind of Jewish, he's got the lines of the Edomites, which their sign, their banner, well, not their banner, their sign, their icon, if you will, it was the eagle. Well, the Jews tore that eagle down eventually, and he got really angry, but that's another part of the story. Herod the Great dies in 4 BC. That's why it was the end of his reign. He was 70 years old when he died. His son, Herod Antipas, whose reign started in 4 BC, and he reigns until 39 AD. Now, so he's the Herod during Christ's speaking and his teaching. So that's the Herod that John the Baptist had to deal with, who had his head cut off. And also Jesus was handed over to trial, to Pilate, by this second Herod. You see the line, though, that the first Herod was the king of the Jews? Guess who wanted to keep that thing going? That's why he had to kill Jesus. The first Herod wanted to kill him before he became a threat. The second Herod was going to hand him over because he didn't want to have anything to do with him. See how all of this goes? I'm going to read you, if you want to turn there, we're going to wrap up shortly, Isaiah chapter 34 and verse 4. So you have a little bit of a history here. I hope you're seeing how this thread builds, because this is very important to understand, because we will be seeing Israel dealing very, very closely, if you will, and not in a good way, with Palestinians until the time of the Antichrist, which I believe is very soon. I believe you believe it too. This is not going to stop. And the Palestinians are a special subset of the Arab community that has been chosen to be the pawns in this quest to destroy Israel by the Arabs. We're going to talk more about that in a minute. I'm going to wrap up at that. Isaiah 34 and verse 4. Now, I want you to follow along with me in this one. All the stars of the heavens will be dissolved, and the sky rolled up like a scroll. All the starry host will fall, like withered leaves from the vine, like shriveled figs from the fig tree. What do you think he's talking about here? Yeah, but the time frame, not Israel. He's talking about the last days. He's talking about the tribulation. Okay, I mean, has this ever happened before, where the skies rolled up like a scroll? No. This is talking about, I'm setting the context. This is why I asked the question, because the context here is the last days. Remember I said last week, whenever it says, and in that day, well, we didn't read that particular piece, but in that day, so I want you to hear it. Whenever he talks about this cataclysmic change in environment on this planet, on this earth, and the stars falling and all that stuff, he ain't talking about anything that's happened yet. He's talking about what's going to be happening, I believe, very shortly. So that's the context of the time frame. We just set that. Verse 5. My sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. See, it descends in judgment on whom? Edom. And you know what the King, anybody have the King James Version? What is it? Does it say, instead of Edom, it should say something else?
For which verse?
For verse 5. And it descends in judgment on Edom. I don't know if they did.
Edom.
Okay. The regular King James Version does not say Edom. It says Idumea. So my sword has drunk its fill in the heavens. See, it descends in judgment on Idumea, the people I have totally destroyed. You see, he's talking about it as already having been done, because he's already destroyed them in that day. But that means they will be around until the tribulation, doesn't it? This is the point. Verse 6. The sword of the Lord is bathed in blood. It is covered with fat, the blood of lambs and goats, fat from the kidneys of the rams. Would you say this is the day of judgment? Has God done any of this yet? For the Lord has a sacrifice in Bozrah and great slaughter in Idumea. Great slaughter in Idumea. And the wild oxen will fall with them, and the bull and the calves and the great bulls. Their land will be drenched with blood, and the dust will be soaked with fat. He's saying their land. Wait a minute, they don't have a land. Isn't that what all this negotiations supposedly about, is giving them a land? Because they will have their own state. They will. That's what Scripture keeps saying out loud to me. They will. For the Lord has a day of vengeance, a year of retribution to uphold Zion's cause. By the way, I just got to make a comment here. You better watch for this. There's a church institution. They are now saying that Zionism is racism, just like the Arabs are saying. Be careful of a Christian who doesn't know what Zionism is, or whoever, God forbid, have mercy on their little pitiful soul, if they ever say that Zionism is racism. God is a Zionist. Never forget that. Because if you are against Zion, or I am against Zion, guess what? We are against God's people, and we hate them. What does God say to those who bless Israel? They will be blessed. What does he say about those who curse Israel? Be very careful when you hear that. Question someone's point of view. Judge them, not their total Christianity, not their state in Jesus Christ, but you judge evil, and I must judge evil when we hear it. We must judge everything. Don't you know that you'll be judging angels someday? Think about that. Verse 9. Edom's streams will be turned into pitch, her dust into burning sulfur. Her land will become blazing pitch. It will not be quenched night and day. Its smoke will rise forever. From generation to generation, it will lie desolate. No one will ever pass through it again. Sounds like we just read from Obadiah, doesn't it? It's a little angry here. I'm just going to read you this. Just listen. Ezekiel 36, verses 1 through 7. Just listen, because we're running out of time. Son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, O mountain of Israel, hear the word of the Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says. The enemy said of you, the ancient heights have become our possession. Therefore prophesy and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says, because they ravaged and hounded you, from every side, so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations. Isn't that interesting? And the object of people's malicious talk and slander. Isn't that what's going on today? Malicious talk and slander against Israel? Aren't they a possession? And what did the Pope say? I told you this. He wants them in internationally recognized borders. They're becoming a possession of the nations of the world. Therefore, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of the sovereign Lord. This is what the sovereign Lord says to the mountains of Israel. And he says, in my burning zeal, I have spoken against the rest of the nations and against all, in King James, Idumea. For with glee and with malice in their hearts they have made my land their own possession, so they might plunder its pasture land. And it goes on, but you see the point. We have Obadiah, we have Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. I don't have to tell you anymore. Here's some fast facts. We got 5 minutes left. The first time the land was named Palestine, do you know when that was? Anybody know when that was? I mentioned it before. Okay, let me ask this question. Do you think, and you don't have to answer it, but just think. I'm asking you because I want you to think about this. Do you think that the land always was named Palestine? Because it is called Palestine in the Bible. No, it hasn't, though. It's from when Titus ransacked the temple and destroyed it. He not only did that, he did some other mean things, including sowing salt into the land so that you couldn't grow anything. He hated them so much that he changed the name to Philistina. But anyway, the point is that the name stuck with Philistine because he wanted to name it after the Philistines, which were Israel's enemy of the people of Goliath, which were the giants in those days. You see how all this ties together? Rome is in league with all of these people who hate Israel. These are Satan's people. And there's this memory, I'm telling you, it goes through the whole thing. He declared that Israel would be no more, and he would know, and the term Israel would be banned from language pretty much, and it would be known as Palestine. The name Palestine was derived from the Philistines. The Palestine has never then existed. It was only a name given to that area by Titus. It never existed before or since as an autonomous entity. It was ruled by Rome, right? Rome conquered them finally. Then by Islamic and Christian crusaders. And then a little forward in time by the Ottoman Empire until World War I, when the British took it over from the Ottoman Empire and they owned it. And then they just said they made a mandate that it would be a home for the Jews and also for these Arabs, these Palestinians. Because there were hardly any Arabs around in those days. They were starting to grow in population. And guess who was scared of them? Britain. Just like we're scared of them today. Do you know why we formed our American Navy? Do you know why? Because we were the Barbary pirates. But who are these pirates? Arabs. That's right. They were Islamic. Are we doing the same thing today? Are we fighting the same thing today? You see, this is nothing new with these people. This thread of how they work, they live, what was prophesied? They live by the sword. Palestinians are Arabs, and they're indistinguishable from the Arabs of Jordan, but they are from Jordan, from Syria, from Lebanon, from Iraq, etc., all the Arab countries. But here's the quotes. Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir said in a Washington Times interview in June 16, 1969, quote, "There are no such things as Palestinians. When was there an independent Palestinian people with a Palestinian state? It was either southern Syria before the First World War, and then it was a Palestine including Jordan. It was not as though there were a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them. They did not exist." She's right. Now, here's the same kind of quote almost 10 years later from Zahir Hussein to a Dutch newspaper in March of 1977. He was the PLO executive committee member at that time. He was part of the committee. Here's his quote. This is from the PLO executive committee member. "The Palestinian people does not exist. The creation of a Palestinian state is only a means for continuing our struggle against the state of Israel for our Arab unity. In reality, today there is no difference between Jordanians, Palestinians, Syrians, and Lebanese. Only for political and tactical reasons do we speak today about the existence of a Palestinian people. Since Arab national interests demand that we position the existence of a district Palestinian people to oppose Zionism. For tactical reasons, Jordan, which is a sovereign state with defined borders, cannot raise claim to Haifa and Jaffa, which as a Palestinian I can undoubtedly demand Haifa, Jaffa, Beersheba, and Jerusalem. However, the moment we reclaim our right to all of Palestine, we will not even wait a minute to unite Palestine and Jordan." That's my point. There is the desire. Now I'm going to read you one last quote. Genesis chapter 28, verses 6 through 9. You can read it in my notes. I'm going to read it to you, tying this all together. "Now Esau learned that Isaac had blessed Jacob and had sent him to Padan Aram to take a wife from there, and that when he blessed him, he commanded him, 'Do not marry a Canaanite woman.'" Remember, Isaac was not supposed to marry a Canaanite woman. "And that Jacob had obeyed his father and mother and had gone to Padan Aram. Esau then realized how displeasing the Canaanite women were to his father Isaac. So he went to Ishmael and married Mahalath, the sister of Nebaioth, and here's the thing that does matter, the daughter of Ishmael." he marries a daughter of Ishmael, son of Abraham, in addition to the wives he already had. That's the end game. Edom melds with the Arab people. You heard the history we went through these last 3 weeks or so. At the end game, Edom is used as a pawn, as a subset of the Arab people. They're all cousins with Israel. They're the same DNA. But they've been a pause used throughout history from the Romans, Nebuchadnezzar before that, and now forward to this day and into the tribulation. And then God will destroy them because they are the special subset of Arabs that have really pushed Israel into the sea if they could. Does that tie it all together for you? Because I want you to understand that when you read about these little things about Jacob and Esau and these little things, quote unquote little things that we read in Genesis, once you understand Genesis, the rest is just detail. Have a good week.